You're listening to the Today's Family Lawyer podcast, the leading source of daily news and insight for family law practitioners in England and Wales. Sign up to our free weekly newsletter at todaysfamilylawyer.co.uk and subscribe to hear all the latest news and views from across the family law sector. You can also follow us on LinkedIn and Twitter.
Hello, welcome along to the latest Today's Family Lawyer podcast. Today I'm talking with Caroline Glass. Caroline is a private domestic abuse advisor, and obviously the topic of conversation then is going to be what you do, how you do it, how you support people who are impacted by domestic abuse. It's great to have you on the podcast, Caroline. Thanks very much indeed for joining.
Thank you, David. Thanks.
So in the first instance, I know we've had a chat in sort of preparation for this, and I've got a bit of an idea of what a domestic abuse advisor is. But if you could tell our listeners a bit about yourself, what you do, and then what a domestic abuse advisor is, what your role is.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm a domestic abuse advisor I've worked in the sector for over 15 years now. Most of that has been for the charity Refuge, and part of that was working on the National Domestic Abuse Helpline, which Refuge runs. So it's a national helpline that's open 24/7 every day of the year. I worked on that initially as a volunteer. I'd done a degree in criminology and wanted just to do some volunteering while my children were little, because clearly I'm a glutton for punishment. And so worked on the helpline as a volunteer and really felt that I'd kind of found my mothership. This was where I wanted to be. This was what I wanted to do. It was quite late in my kind of professional development, really, because by then I was mid-30s. So I worked on the National Domestic Abuse Helpline. I then became employed by them, so I was a member of staff. And then from there I went to work as an IDVA. So that's an independent domestic violence advocate. So that is a caseworker who supports victims of domestic abuse who have been assessed as considered to be at high risk of serious harm or homicide. So I worked as an IDVA with one of the Refuge services in Lambeth in South London, a service called the Gaia Centre. And there I was an IDVA working with all high risk caseworkers. And then I progressed on to managing that, being a deputy manager for the service and managing the caseworkers who dealt with all of the high-risk cases and the children's services, so any children that were involved in gender-based violence. So I helped run that service, and as part of that role, I worked with the Met Police, I worked with social services, I delivered training to them. I was co-located at Brixton Police Station, so worked in a very close way to police officers to help them provide the best support to victims of domestic abuse. And then midway through COVID, I decided that I wanted to step away from working in that capacity. I still wanted to work with victims of domestic abuse, but I wanted to actually focus in a more honed way, because as a caseworker and then overseeing caseworkers, you can have 30 to 40 clients. So there is a high risk of burnout, and I would say actually that I was burning out. And so I stepped away during COVID, and I thought I would set up by myself as a private domestic abuse advisor. As far as I'm aware, no one else has done this, and it was a bit of a punt, really. It was a bit of a shot in the dark to see whether or not it would be an option. And so I approached lots of law firms where they have family law teams to see if they would work with me to help them provide a more holistic support to their clients. Because as an IDVA, I would often be referring to family lawyers, and I would see that my clients would go to their family lawyer with questions that really the family lawyer doesn't necessarily have the training to provide, obviously not necessarily legal information. Also, it's not cost effective, it's not time effective. So I thought if I could work alongside the lawyer, we could in tangent provide the best support for those clients. So as a domestic abuse advisor, I provide safeguarding and practical guidance, as I did as an IDVA, but I do it now in a private capacity alongside a lawyer, or just not even necessarily working in tangent with a lawyer, just independently of them. to provide the best outcome for their colleagues.
You've articulated the opportunity that being a private domestic abuse advisor presents. Can you talk about some of the practicalities of what that looks like, how that works?
Now, obviously, what needs to happen with all domestic abuse cases is a risk assessment is carried out. So I would have obviously done that as an IDVA, and I continue to do that now. So my methods are still very similar to when I worked as an IDVA. It's just much more detailed, because as an IDVA, as a caseworker working for a charity, as I've said, if you've got 30 to 40 clients, you do not have the time to really do an in-depth risk assessment as much as you want to, and that passion and that interest and that need is there. You don't necessarily have the time. So I will carry out a detailed risk assessment, which is really a consultation that can go on over a number of hours, anything from 3 to 5 hours, to really dig down into what's happened. So I go right back to the beginning of the relationship with the victim. I explore how the relationship has developed, how domestic abuse has started to escalate and grow, because domestic abuse follows a pattern of escalation. It starts off really slow and it can be innocuous and subtle, and then gradually it becomes more and more obvious. So I will carry out a risk assessment with the client, really unpicking everything that's happened. And the way that I do that is by asking lots and lots of questions. I pose lots of scenarios, because a victim may well have normalized or minimized what's happening to them. It becomes part of their everyday life. It's just how they manage their partner. It's just how they manage their safety. So they aren't necessarily cognizant of the fact that it is coercive control or manipulative behavior. So that's why I ask lots of questions. So I don't expect my clients to come up with the goods. I will hopefully kind of encourage them to remember what's happening. Clearly, I'm not planting memories, but I'm encouraging them to remember and identify behaviours, so that we can then work out what the high risk categories are, and then can go from there with regard to what we need to do with regard to their safety. But from there, what I would do is work out what their options and their rights are. So this is really where I work alongside the family lawyer, because it may be that I am exploring non-molestation orders, occupation orders, prohibited steps orders. Equally, it could be that I'm looking at housing rights, marital rights, social services intervention. So beyond what really the solicitor may be able to advise, I will also be exploring what that looks like, what social services intervention looks like. If the client wants to report to the police, what that looks like, what those stages are, potentially what the outcome is going to be, and also things that they need to make sure they need to flag with the police officer. For example, making sure a restraining order is asked for, making sure that they have the protective measures in court when they attend. So really extending the knowledge that a solicitor can provide to make sure that client is as supported and as safe as possible, while educating the client so that they are fully aware of exactly what's going on and why the perpetrator is doing what they're doing.
There's a big drive in family law to be more collaborative. There's an acknowledgement that the family lawyer isn't the be all and end all when it comes to knowing about everything they need to know about. I've done some recent podcasts about pensions, for example, and the importance of bringing pension advice in. I've done some podcasts with divorce coaches, and again, they bring a certain level of expertise. Clearly, this is what you're talking about. You bring a certain level of expertise into the equation then, Caroline.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm very much of the mind that it takes a family to really provide the holistic support to the client. So solicitors or mediators will refer their clients to me, because a client will present and maybe carry out a MIAM, or maybe explore, that they're seeking a divorce, or maybe they're further down the line and it's a child arrangements order or something, but they're presenting to the solicitor. And when the solicitor starts to assess the client and chat with them about what their needs are and what their experiences are, it becomes evident very often to the solicitor, not necessarily to the client, that controlling behaviour is there. So, for example, with the MIAM, if a couple are wanting to go through mediation, Most mediators would not work with a couple where there's domestic abuse. So it tends to come out quite quickly when the individual is completing this MIAM, that there is manipulative behaviour, that there is potentially a power imbalance, that maybe there is a level of fear there where the client who is experiencing domestic abuse doesn't feel empowered or safe enough to express their needs. Now that obviously rings alarm bells for the professional, for the practitioner, but it may just be perfectly normal for the client. That's how they've lived. They've always had to censor themselves. They've had to be very mindful of creating a reaction in their partner. So what can happen is a practitioner will become aware that there is a power imbalance, and for whatever reason, the practitioner will want to support that client as much as possible, so that they can really be empowered to understand exactly what's going on and get the best possible results out of their case. So a solicitor may well refer to me at that point, and it may well be that they're referring to me when the client has no idea at all that this is domestic abuse. There may well have been financial manipulation or financial control expressed. It may well be apparent to the solicitor that the victim is isolated, doesn't have support from friends or family. It may be, as I've said, that there is a level of fear there. There is a level of coercion there where the client doesn't feel free to speak. And so at that point, the practitioner may well feel to get the best outcome for that client, they really need to be fully informed. They need to know exactly who they're dealing with regards to their partner. They need to be aware of what that partner is potentially going to do in the legal process, because a perpetrator doesn't stop perpetrating abuse at the point of separation. It usually just gets worse. And certainly if there are children involved, that is a perfect tool for that perpetrator to assert even more control. And a solicitor will usually, in my experience, be very aware of that and will obviously want to be supporting their client as best they can. So they may refer to me. They may also refer to other professionals, for example, a therapist, potentially a divorce coach, someone where they feel that that client can then have their case enhanced. But with regard to me, it's usually because domestic abuse is present and they feel that the client is going to require some further support to help them get through this, really what is quite an arduous process.
But equally, and I know there's a huge amount of work that's gone into a better understanding of domestic abuse and coercive control, there must be an element of your role where you're educating the practitioners as well about identifying this, because it can be so subtle as well.
Absolutely. So, and that very often happens. So because as I said earlier, I carry out these really detailed consultations with the client, I unpick everything in minute detail. And I also ask a lot of questions that can be really quite private and that the client may not have disclosed to their solicitor, understandably. So what I can identify usually is financial abuse that hasn't become evident up and maybe until further down the proceedings, but also, is there psychological manipulation? Is there belittling? Is there chipping away at that individual's sense of their self-esteem, their boundaries? Is there the notion that the perpetrator is in some way superior to the victim and therefore is entitled to behave in this way? Domestic abuse is very much predicated on this notion of entitlement. And a perpetrator will feel that they are absolutely justified to behave in the way that they are, and that will become part of the victim's lived experience. And they very often will feel that the perpetrator isn't actually abusing them. This is just how they behave in our relationship. So by asking lots and lots of questions, I can really unpick, as you say, the really subtle forms of coercive and controlling behaviour. Has the victim been isolated? Are they able to have friendships? Are they able to see their friends and family? Are they able to speak freely, have difference of opinions? Because that's something that sometimes goes under the radar, that a perpetrator will deny the victim the ability to speak freely, to have an opinion, maybe to have an opinion on how they live, on how they raise their children, on where they live, really on anything. And so I will explore all of the really subtle types of domestic abuse. And a lot of that is based on having done this for so many years that I will have extensive experience of methods that perpetrators have used to exert this coercive control. But also it becomes often a very natural conversation with the client, because they will say something and then that will obviously encourage me to ask further questions. So we can really dig down. I will then ask questions, as I've said, that might be much more private and may not be asked by the solicitor because they would feel it's not appropriate and it's potentially not relevant. So, for example, I may well ask about types of physical violence, about strangulation, maybe about sexual abuse, things that are high-risk indicators, maybe drug misuse or alcohol misuse by the perpetrator, coping strategies by the victim, which may also involve alcohol misuse or drug misuse. So I will be wanting to explore those red flag indicators as well, so that we can really see whether or not that victim is at risk of a serious escalation on separation. And then, do we need to put in safety planning mechanisms? Do we actually need to then maybe explore a non-molestation order or potentially a report to the police? This is not something I usually go to, but in some cases it feels a safe thing to do, but it's not always.
I'm guessing, and you tell me, but the danger, challenge, risk here is that you only become involved at the point at which a firm, a practitioner is engaged. I mean, this goes on behind closed doors every day.
Yeah, absolutely. So certainly if I'm referred a client through this mechanism, through a solicitor, it's usually because a relationship has reached breaking point and the couple are going through a divorce. It could be that the couple have divorced and the perpetrator is using a child arrangements order as a means to further manipulate and abuse the victim. So yes, we usually are at relative crisis points. And what can happen is that by carrying out a risk assessment and really identifying exactly what the perpetrator's done, that fully pulls the wool from the eyes of the victim. And that can also elevate their risk, because they can then become fully aware of what they've had to live with and become, understandably outraged. So I then have to manage that and manage their safety. I will discuss what they should be doing in the home. I'll be discussing how they communicate with the perpetrator to make sure they're as safe as possible, that they don't obviously share that they're working with a domestic abuse advisor, that they don't demonstrate a need to reassert their rights in a way that is potentially going to inflame the perpetrator. And if they are going to want to then separate, for example, maybe they were divorcing and they're living in the same home, but it becomes evident that domestic abuse is escalating while they're living in the same home, we may explore how they can separate safely. So, for example, I've got a client at the moment where the client was in an absolutely untenable position with the perpetrator that she was divorcing, and we were able to work alongside with the solicitor to get another safe property. She has now rented a property and she has moved out, and they share care of the children. But that had to be done alongside with the solicitor becoming fully involved and fully aware of what the risks were based on the behaviours of the perpetrator.
We're talking in the weeks after the Richard Spencer case story broke. Obviously, it was a documentary, also covered on today's Family Lawyer. And that was a case in which the wife is the perpetrator, the female is the perpetrator, which is unusual. If it's not too distasteful a question, what's new in domestic abuse? What do practitioners need to be looking out for that is different now?
Okay, so certainly male victims is not new. I've worked with very many male victims of domestic abuse, be that where the perpetrator is male as well as female. The majority of victims of domestic abuse are female, and I still think there is an enormous stigma for male victims to come forwards. And in fact, when I work with male victims, I often talk about controlling behaviour rather than abusive behaviour, because they do struggle. And I know I'm saying this in the broadest sense, so I obviously don't want to cause offence by using brushstrokes like this, but I think men do struggle with the notion that they are in some way a victim or a survivor of domestic abuse because of the connotations of there being physical abuse and therefore being demeaned in that way. Domestic abuse covers a whole spectrum of behaviour, one of which is physical abuse. So male victims certainly are out there, have always been out there, and will continue to be out there. And I think we may see, as a consequence of that report, far more men feeling empowered to come forward, which is exactly what we want. I want to work with any victim of domestic abuse, no matter their gender, their age, their ethnicity, whatever it is. Other areas that are new, obviously, is technological abuse. So that's something that I am seeing all the time now, where there is the use of spyware, hacking, monitoring devices routinely being used by perpetrators of coercive control. Smart devices in the home being used to monitor, devices like an Alexa being able to listen in, ring doorbells, monitoring the comings and goings of victims, CCTV being installed covertly. Obviously, cars now with GPS tracking systems means a perpetrator can very easily monitor where that individual is coming and going. So that is something that's obviously been on the radar for a number of years, but is escalating more. The more able everyone becomes to use it, you don't need to be a tech expert to use that. I think because of a worrying rise in violent pornography, I'm also seeing a rise in sexual violence being normalised in relationships. So I'm seeing a rise in the routine use of strangulation. Now, strangulation is one of the highest risk indicators that I look for when assessing a client, because if a client has experienced strangulation more than twice, they are 7 times more at risk of homicide. So, and someone can lose consciousness within a matter of seconds. So when I am assessing a client, I will ask whether or not strangulation has occurred during an incident, but also during intimacy. So there is quite an escalation in tech abuse, in sexual violence. And there's also been, I think, because now people are much more aware of domestic abuse and the language of domestic abuse. Certainly during COVID, obviously there was an explosion in media cases, and there was obviously an explosion in homicides, but it meant that the general public became much more familiar with the language. And so now I do see very many perpetrators using the language of coercive control, portraying themselves as victims and attempting to use that kind of language to coerce a victim themselves, portraying the victim as a perpetrator, contacting social services, which has happened for a very long time, but now having the skills and the language to identify their supposed victimhood. Now, this is quite difficult, obviously, to sometimes recognise, but when I carry out detailed risk assessments, because they take so long, it is actually fairly evident quite quickly whether or not I'm dealing with a perpetrator or I'm dealing with a victim. I think very often, actually, solicitors do become aware when they're actually dealing with a perpetrator rather than the victim. But certainly that kind of language, that knowledge is something that I've seen a rise of, and it has been weaponised.
So if we can use the opportunity in the podcast to help educate family lawyers about this and help to identify them, is there anything that you could particularly share that you think would be really useful for them, or do you think there's plenty of information out there that they can access?
Well, there's something that I have used from when I first started working with Refuge, which is a diagnostic tool called the Power and Control Wheel. And it's a bicycle wheel broken up into different spokes, and within each spoke it identifies different forms of coercive and controlling behaviour. And that can actually be quite powerful for the victim, because they probably will have been told time and time again that actually what they're experiencing isn't real, that they are potentially the perpetrator themselves, that this is perfectly normal, and be held accountable and responsible for the abuse they're experiencing. So they can very often struggle to process the fact that actually they are a victim of domestic abuse. So this wheel can help maybe the solicitor as well as the client, the victim, to really identify what strategies of control have been used to manipulate and assert dominance and power over them. But I would also say, when solicitors are working with their clients, if the client expresses a level of fear, then that is always something that they should be alert to. If they are expressing a fear that the perpetrator knows things about them, knows their movements, their actions, conversations that they've had, that does not mean that the client is paranoid. it means that in all likelihood there is some kind of covert monitoring happening. If a client is coming along and is demonstrating that they are frightened of their partner and that they feel unable to speak freely and to ask for things that is their right for fear of there being a repercussion, that would indicate that there is some form of domestic abuse. I would imagine that most solicitors though would be aware of that, but certainly when assessing for high risk indicators, fear is one of the most important ones to actually look for.
We're fast moving towards the end of the discussion, and what you've presented us is very, very comprehensive, Caroline. So thank you very much indeed for all your insight. I guess I just had a kind of practical question to finish on then, which is about the dynamic of the relationship that you have with your client. Because we've said and we've identified, certainly in your previous role, for example, that a lot of this support is available without a huge amount of cost associated with it, shall we say. Obviously, you're working now in a private capacity. How does that change the dynamic of the relationship with the client, but then also with the firm as well?
There are charities out there where victims of domestic abuse can reach out for the support. The problem is there are enormous waiting lists. And as I've said, to be able to provide bespoke support, a lot of my clients are professionals and they don't have the time to fit in with the caseworker. They will need to say, okay, I've got availability at X, Y, or Z time. So if you wanted to work with a charity, you actually have to be very much able to fit in with the caseworker's time frame. And also there is a limit to the amount of time a caseworker can give. So the way I work is obviously much more based on the needs and to provide an immediate response to that victim. What's really important, and it's really important for any caseworker working with victims of domestic abuse, is to strike while the iron is hot. Strike while that victim feels able to reach out for support, because very often they will lose that courage. It takes enormous bravery to be able to speak to someone about what's happening in their relationship, and to have to wait maybe weeks to speak to a caseworker if that's what's happening with one of the charities. Unfortunately, that means that that individual may change their mind and may return to the perpetrator. So I will provide support that is very much as immediate as it can be within the week. The way I work also is over the phone or via Zoom, so that I can work with anyone across the country. Now that is the same as charities, although I'm not sure if they do Zoom calls now. They may do. Obviously the world has moved on over the past few years, but it means I can work in a way that it is sufficiently confidential and anonymous with that individual, because sometimes clients actually will want to see me like they're working with a therapist, and others will want the anonymity of a telephone call. So we can do it in any way that suits them. And also what I do for my clients, which I wouldn't have been able to do when working for Refuge, is that I can write detailed reports for them. So I will write a detailed summary of exactly what has happened in their relationship, so that they are able to read in hard copy how the domestic abuse has developed, and it will break it down into all the different types of coercive control. And they can use this report to help work with their team, their legal team. Also, a lot of clients will use it because it will help them really stay on the straight and narrow and remember why they're needing to free themselves from the abuse, because it's a very easy dynamic to slip back into the thinking that they are responsible for what's happened to them, that they have a level of complicity or guilt, and therefore they need to forgive the perpetrator. So having a report can help them identify exactly what's happened and what is likely to happen going forwards. Now, all of those things I couldn't have done working for a charity, because you just don't have the time. It is a much more fulfilling role that I can work with that client. And then obviously they can come back to me as and when they need. We build up a very close relationship. They're telling me things that in all likelihood they wouldn't have told anybody else. And so they do feel that they have someone who absolutely understands what they've gone through, will validate them, will empower them, will give them a bit of fire in their belly if they need it, if they're going to court, and will also help them overcome hurdles that are going to be coming on the horizon, depending on how they're trying to push back against the perpetrator and the perpetrator's tactics of control.
I think most practitioners are well aware that awareness of domestic abuse is on the rise, if not necessarily domestic abuse itself, because it went hidden for an awful long time. You're right. The pandemic really brought it to the fore, didn't it? Which was really important. But it's been really interesting to talk through some of your own experiences, Caroline, and also just share some insight into what practitioners might need to be looking out for, and what is happening in and around this space, because the definition changed, forgive me, I can't remember how many years ago, but we've gone from domestic violence to domestic abuse, which covers this much larger swathe of tactics. But that's it. That's as much as we've got time for. Probably can't do it justice in half an hour, but it's been brilliant to have you on the podcast. Thanks so much for joining.
Thank you. Thank you, David. It's been my pleasure.
The Today's Family Lawyer podcast is available on your preferred podcast provider. It's also available on todaysfamilylawyer.co.uk. My thanks to Caroline. Thank you as ever for listening, and we'll see you again soon.
You're listening to the Today's Family Lawyer podcast, the leading source of daily news and insight for family law practitioners in England and Wales. Sign up to our free weekly newsletter at todaysfamilylawyer.co.uk and subscribe to hear all the latest news and views from across the family law sector. You can also follow us on LinkedIn and Twitter.